Thanks.
Well, that was a very good interaction. I appreciate that. What I do want to do now is just turn the corner and start talking about our regulations, making sure that what is in the regs is clear and understandable for what we're doing. The first thing, we've already talked about this, and if it hadn't come up already, I wanted to make sure that we talked about it. Part 570, our regulations that we're talking about here, doesn't have any provisions in it related to production of LNG, production of natural gas. It doesn't deal with hydrofracking. The reality is, as Andrew already mentioned, our law goes back 40 years ago, before there was any discussion of this. So what we're working on, while everybody has understood the tangential nature of it and the state policy issues, what we're dealing with directly in the regulations that we're going to talk about now don't directly have anything to do with the hydrofracking. So what does it have to talk about? So let's talk about the actual regulation itself. So let's basically walk through the regulations, section by section. We're going to stop and talk about various key provisions and those type of things. So 570.1, very beginning of the regs, is the opening introduction. It talks about the purpose of the regs, talking about dealing with this criteria for the siting of facilities and having to require data permit, owners having to comply with the regulations and the permits that are there. So it starts off with some very basic stuff. We get into some definitions, and there's a couple of key definitions that we want to just touch on and make sure everybody understands what it is that we're dealing with. An LNG facility, what are we talking about there? We're talking about any structure or facility that is storing LNG or converting LNG into natural gas. So we're not talking about production, we're not even talking about people that take natural gas and make it into LNG. We're talking about the storage of LNG and the conversion of LNG into natural gas. So it's a limited scope of what we're talking about. Tank system, we're talking about, if we're going to store LNG, we're talking about putting it inside a storage tank. It's going to be a stationary device used to store the LNG. We're not talking about the mobile facilities, those type of things. We're talking about a stationary storage tank. The reason I talk about the mobile aspect is when people have a vehicle that is powered by natural gas, that has an LNG storage tank on it, it converts it to natural gas, and in and of itself could be construed as a facility, but that's a car driving down the highway, a truck driving down the highway. We don't have permits. It's not an LNG facility. It's not something that gets a permit in order to have a vehicle that's powered by natural gas. A couple other key definitions. LNG Transportation Activity. Those are certain activities that involve the loading and unloading and the transportation of the LNG. We'll talk about in a moment, as a key exemption is if it's LNG transportation activity, it's not a permit from this department. Last but not least, in the key definitions is interstate transportation. We've talked a little bit about what is intrastate versus interstate, and the fact that DOT is not going to get involved with route certification for intrastate. So if people can't use intrastate and they have to use interstate, what does that mean? So here's what, working with DOT, they came back with and said, we consider this to be interstate transportation. So do three basic things. It starts at a point in New York and goes out of the state, that's interstate, crosses state boundary lines. If it starts out of state, we're in a different country, and comes into the state, that's interstate. The last one was one that people get a little confused with. If it starts in New York State and goes to New York State, but it goes through another state or country, that is also considered interstate transportation. So those are the three areas, three ways that people having to get natural gas, that they can't produce it at their site, and they have to get it from an outside source, they have to have interstate transportation of LNG. This is where they would be looking to figure that out. So a couple of things in the regulations as we're dealing with the law and trying to put our arms around exactly what it is that needs a permit. Some things that we've defined as being exempt from this regulation. LNG tanker trucks used for short-term periods to maintain pipeline pressure. Now, this is to be looked at as basically a natural gas pipeline supplying businesses, homes. They have to do maintenance, they have to interrupt the gas supply. They have a choice. Turn off everybody downstream and tell everybody you can't have gas, or they bring in an LNG tanker and they transfer the supply to this tanker truck and vaporize that into the pipeline so people downstream can continue to have gas service while they do the maintenance on the pipeline. Because that involves the transfer, the conversion of LNG to natural gas, it could be considered a facility. We've looked at that and said utilities need to have the ability to do pipeline maintenance. It's not going to be considered a facility. LNG transportation activities, which we just defined a moment ago. The transportation activity itself is not a permit underneath our regulation. Caveat, make sure everybody understands that doesn't mean that intrastate subject is still subject to the routing requirements. They still have to follow whatever DOT comes up with, and if the case if they don't have any route certification, it can't be done. There are certain emergency situations that occur, and the governor has the ability to declare an emergency, and if there's an emergency, you don't have to get a permit. So we're just recognizing the governor's power to declare an emergency and not require permits there. Last but not least, an exemption from having to get a permit are 3 existing facilities that pre-existed the law from 1976 that are still in operation today. They do not have to get a permit. That was the way the legislature set that up. They do not want to have to require them to go through the permit process. And we'll talk about it in a moment, as long as they don't make any changes. They can't do any modifications. So, jumping real quickly to those points, that's just the opening applicability definitions and stuff. We'll take some more questions and try to limit these. And we should take the 2 people first.
Yes. Okay. You made it clear the size of these facilities is not in the purview of the regulations. I would ask if the setbacks that might be required would be in relation to size, and then I have another second small question.
The answer to yes, and actually we're going to be talking about that in much more detail in about 4 more slides. So you'll get a more detailed answer to that very shortly.
The next question is probably to the attorney. Is there any reason town or village or county or whatever could not just simply ban this thing? Thank you.
Well, we've seen some interesting rulings recently on the home rule issue. I haven't looked at in detail, haven't analyzed that question. There's, as you guys have pointed out, there's LNG transported now across the state. I think there would be, some larger issues connected with interference with interstate commerce for a locality to attempt to make such a ban. The siting of the facility,
Local zoning.
there's local zoning controls that will have to be complied with now. And I'm hesitant to make a yes or no answer on that. I haven't analyzed it completely. It's a good question, and I'm sorry I don't have a more complete answer on that. I'm not sure.
Thank you. I'd just like to expand a little bit on your earlier comment made. This procedure is too limited in scope, and you should be looking, of course, at
the build-out consequences, potential consequences of enabling LNG technology within the state are assumptions TV that the only small facilities so far are trucking. I question that assumption. There are LNG companies outside the state that are looking for large factories, hospitals, and so on, as customers. If they found a sufficient number of customers within the state, then it seems pretty evident to me that they want to set up pressurization facilities here, refrigeration facilities, and of course transportation within the state. So it seems to me that this procedure is equivalent to a constitutional pipeline company claiming that their 120-mile pipeline will call for one compressor station. That was obviously a lie. So the DCC procedures on this subject are inadequate.
I'm very interested in that opportunity of rules, legislation, and regulations and different ones. And one of the things I think I should appreciate is that there's a clear clarity in the words that you use, the documents that you write. And it was stated a moment ago that these LNG facilities would not include production facilities. Well, that's about as clear as mud in these regulations. Your definition says any structural facility used or store identified natural gas in a tank system. However, production facility has tanks on site. That is parcel of the operations that they do. So the production facilities are also going to be storage systems, very likely. And so the question is, are these production facilities going to fall underneath these auspices of your regulatory authority or not? And then when you look at the regulatory impact statement, you actually say production facility is one of the things that could be permitted according to the so there's a big contradiction here, and I hope that is ironed out, not just today, but if these go forward, I'm changing what you've written here. Thank you.
Yep. So let me try and clarify what I said and what was intended there. If we had a production facility that stored LNG, that would constitute a facility because they're storing LNG. However, we have heard of people that produce LNG and put it directly into the tanker and drive the tanker away. And so they don't have any on-site storage, and that is an LNG transportation activity, obviously very small scale because they didn't have any storage. So they would have a tanker and they would produce and drive it away. That would be something that could be outside of a permit because they didn't have any storage and they didn't do any conversion. But anytime you have a large-scale production facility where they have a storage tank, that's obviously now an LNG facility because they have storage there.
Okay, so it's very clear here. You have some explanation in the that state that. I think we all know that so which means
But you wouldn't be regulating the production aspect of it.
That's exactly right.
Storage.
That's the difference.
Yes,
So again, there is a concern.
I appreciate that.
My question is similar. The definition of a tank, does that include all pipelines however long that goes from, say, one facility to another?
One facility to another.
That's a very interesting question. So I'm trying to think. We're looking at our definition here, and certainly a tank system includes the piping associated with it. The wrinkle that you added to it is inter-facility piping, so it would be leaving one site and going to another. There's two aspects there. One, you end up with getting it off of one property where we'd have a permit, and so I'm not sure. But the other aspect is just the characteristics of LNG itself. It's stored inside the tank, and you don't put it inside pipelines. It's not something that can be transported in that way. So I'm not sure I've got a complete answer for you, but I'm not sure it's going to be something that we'd have to deal with very frequently, if at all.
There won't be the gas won't be in.
You can't put it in a pipeline.
Right, it's because there's
Short distances.
only short distances because the natural gas is at negative 260 degrees, thereabouts, 259. So if you put it inside a pipeline, it's not going to have that refrigerated effect. It's going to start warming up. So they can only have it in short pipelines. They're not going to have inter-facility pipelines for LNG.
It's a great segue into the next question. First, just ask, you say production facilities in context here. Are you talking about liquefaction, cooling, et cetera?
Right.
I know that the exemption from permitting includes mobile LNG tanks. Do these fuel tanks, for instance, if I'm trying to drive a truck, and my tank is an LNG tank, do I refrigerate that tank? And if so, how long can I dependably carry a liquid nitrogen temperature machine refrigeration? How long can I carry that on in a large truck stuck in a 100-degree temperature in a traffic jam in some locality where there's an accident on the road? I might be sitting there for 5 hours waiting for emergency to clear the route.
Right, so if you have a truck running on LNG, the tanks are cryogenic tanks. That means that it keeps them cold like a dewar, like liquid nitrogen. And my understanding is that it can stay in that state for some days.
And what temperature?
There's different temperatures.
If you want an expert in the industry.
Okay.
There's tank manufacturers that have LNG tanks, store the fuel in the vehicle, and they without it. It's just a real nervous problem.
Indeed, I'm familiar with liquid nitrogen. You don't get even in some spots for 10 days. If I could, one question about whether 570 governs facilities such as the salt mine storage. I thought that I had the impression that these regulations were mentioned both LPG and LNG.
You know, that's exactly
If these regulations are going to be the basis for salt mine storage, I think we're going to have a lot more questions.
Okay, so LPG, mostly propane and butane, is stored at essentially normal temperatures. LNG at 260 degrees below zero, I don't think you could store it in the salt cavern. I don't think you physically could do it.
Yeah, but these regulations are going to be used for storing LPG.
No, they're not. No, the law specifically excludes LPG.
Actually, one question I asked way out back wasn't stressed. Is where this concept of the today coming from? Is this the group that came up on this concept? We're having a meeting, and tell you why I'm asking this question, because often with the hydrocrack mineral, a lot of the stimulus was from the gas pump. So is there a gas company out here? Is there a company that's I don't know. If you guys have a meeting, said these are
we should present that to the people of New York State.
Right. The answer is that this comes from a law that the state legislature passed in 1976. It's the only law like it in the country.
Why is this unsafe today?
Right.
Right, that was the whole purpose of the background story that explains the law was passed, there was a moratorium for a long time, it was lifted, we started working on the regs, there were impediments, we've now overcome those impediments, and now there's a demand, there's a need. Transportation sector.
My question segues into that as well. When Phil was asking about procedures, and I keep hearing from you guys that you're tasked with developing these regulations. That's what I keep hearing. By law, we have to do this. Is that what I'm hearing?
The law directs CEC to promulgate regulations.
Also, but in any land use decision, you have to explore alternatives. And so Bill was asking, what if the alternatives were not going to allow the regulations? And you have to explore any land use decision. In fact, you do. I'm looking on your website, number 8. In your introduction, I say alternative. No action. If Part 570 is not promulgated, CEC cannot issue permits for LNG facilities. Here's what it speaks to why it's happening. Several corporations expressed interest in developing LNG facilities, including fueling stations for heavy trucks. The DOT has interest in installing LNG capabilities statewide. A couple more sentences, seven sentences in all in this section, and by saying rulemaking initiative. Under the alternative no action, you say based on the preceding discussion, a regulation should be promulgated to address safe site construction and operation of LNG facilities. But all you're going on is your service use expanded energy study. I'm a member of Conservative Professional New York, and I implore you to look at that website because we gather information from Shaw and there are health consequences of routine venting of these gases. There are in fact environmental and health consequences. Your study from industry says no. So I'm asking you if during this comment you will look at other studies that are in front of you. And then I have another quick question.
Sure.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, you can submit
All comments will be reviewed.
Okay. And then you asked a question a little bit when I looked at the expanding energy study last night. When it comes to site plan, national regulations are listed. This is some study. Focus on the arrangement of storage tanks and other equipment on the site of an LNG facility, but not on site selection process for where an LNG use can be located. This is in quotes. This limitation on the scope of those regulations is accepted by all states that rely on the national code to regulate LNG facilities. Because the question where an LNG facility may locate is the purview of local land use control zoning regulations. Contacting zoning controls, LNG facilities fit within a defined list of uses which include blah, 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 blah. Generally, such uses not going on, but it does say that they are under local control, and that's something that you should be aware of in the study.
It's in the study, and if it's not directly related to our rulemaking process, and I know we're maybe it appears to be myopic, and we're in the rulemaking process here, and we are promulgating these regulations, or we're going through the process of that. If there's a local challenge, and if there's a local ability to prohibit siting any facilities, that's not part of our rulemaking, whether or not the state permit would apply or not. If there is a local prohibition and it's effective, then it's effective, and it's not part of our review of our rulemaking. But I don't doubt that there may be local ability of localities to have heavy input into siting of these facilities.
Well, what I'm asking and imploring you to not be myopic. You're tasked with the regulations, and you're also mandated to look at no action, and you dismissed that no action to my mind. You didn't take a balanced look at it. definition of an LNG facility as it appears in the regs and that definition section. So it specifically points out that an LNG storage facility falls into the definition of an LNG facility. Then it also goes on to state, as you showed on your PowerPoint presentation, that something that turns LNG into a gas, the regasification is also part of the definition. All right, so the production of LNG is left out of the definition, which would be the cryogenic process, but the liquefaction of the gas into to manufacture LNG. As you've now explained verbally, the fact that most LNG production facilities also store gas would indicate that most manufacturing facilities would be covered under the regs. That's not at all part of your definition. And it's not until you read the regulatory impact statement in which it describes solicitations by businesses who are already interested in locating in New York State that would be permitted under these regs. Do you learn that a business has approached the southern tier about opening a production facility, and that's a proposal that receives laudatory attention in the regulatory impact statement document. So I submit that there is a disparity between how you're defining what a facility is, which would make most reasonable people assume that they don't include liquefaction production when in fact they do. I would also submit, and I'm going to ask this in a form of a question, why the public health impacts, and that's my field of study, environmental health, there are public health risks associated with both ends of the spectrum, in the liquefaction process as well as in the regasification. In the liquefaction process, because you need to remove other volatile hydrocarbons from raw natural gas in order to liquefy it and get something 90% methane or better, you are venting off all kinds of other hydrocarbon gases, which, as my colleague Mary Manipace points out, have consequences for public health. So in the liquefaction process, the air emissions, according to these regs, don't have to be limited, they don't have to be monitored, and we have no idea what we're even going to be exposed to. At the other end of the process, in the regasification, where we're now taking a liquid and going from into a vapor, there's also a process by which benzene and other impurities are going to be removed. And this is often done with flaring. And we know very well that flaring has consequences for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, for formaldehyde, more benzene, and so forth. Those also have public health consequences. So why have public health risks on both ends of the continuum, making it an LNG and then regasification of the other? Why are those left out of the scoping of this? Why has there been no attention paid to those issues? Why is it left out of the definition?
The production facilities are left out of the definition of a facility because that's the way the law is set up.
How are they regulated?
Not by DEC.
DEC does not regulate them.
Nobody.
I don't know the answer to that question.
They could be happening right now.
That's a big problem.
That process,
Well, they does NFPA cover production?
Burke?
Yeah. So the way the law is set up is to charge us to regulate the storage and the conversion. So that's what we do, and that's why the definition is set up. That's our only authority. We don't have the authority to go beyond that from the law.
And what about the emissions on both ends and health effects thereof?
Those are air emission questions, which are beyond the scope of the regulation. Right. So there are other regulations that deal with air emissions that control those releases. Those are separate regulations.
Are there regulated storage facilities?
Yes.
these kinds of storage.
Sure. And if you're releasing these kinds of materials, they're covered by those regulations. So that would be a matter for looking at the appropriate regulation that would cover the particular emissions you're concerned about. This be on the scope of this regulation.